In the year 2000, Garry Kasparov lost his world chess crown to Vladimir Kramnik after suffering greatly in the Berlin variation of the Spanish Opening. Kramnik, not without reason, believed that a slow, maneuvering struggle would not be to Garry Kasparov's liking. Kasparov's pride was wounded, and he wanted at all costs to prove to the entire chess world that he was not only number one in the world rankings, but also number one in the Berlin variation of the Spanish Opening itself. And so, Astana, 2001. Garry sends his king's pawn forward into battle. Kramnik replies with e5. White attacks the pawn, black defends it with the knight, and the Spanish Opening appears on the board. Once again, Kramnik builds his Berlin Wall. Kasparov brings his king to a safe place. Black captures the pawn. White opens the center, where the opposing king still stands. After knight d6, the bishop is attacked, so Kasparov exchanges on c6, then wins back the pawn, exchanges the strongest pieces, and develops his knight to c3. At first glance, it seems that black has obtained a worse version of the exchange variation of the Spanish Opening. Besides the missing pawn on the king side, the king without castling complicates the coordination of the pieces, and the pawn on e5 limits their activity. But on the other hand, with the pawn on e5, control over the light squares is weakened. In addition, after the queens are traded, the tension of the struggle is reduced. Kramnik skillfully varied different sublines of the Berlin, making preparation nearly impossible. The positions are sticky, unforced, and highly diverse. Kasparov plays a prophylactic move, h3. Black develops the bishop, and white prepares a queenside fianchetto. Vladimir clears the d8 square for his rook. White completes the bishop's maneuver, establishing coordination between his heavy pieces. Black responds with rook to d8. The idea behind black's new plan is to trade one pair of rooks along the d-file. The main drawback, however, is that the black king remains in the center, and white must try to use that fact as quickly as possible. Kasparov plays rook d1, and black answers with knight e7, a very important maneuver. The knight heads to g6, ready to restrain white's pawn play on the king side. Kasparov centralizes his pieces. Kramnik places his knight on g6, and soon after, a white knight jumps to e4. The computer recommends c5 here, a complex move leading to a tense struggle. But in the game, Kramnik directed his knight to e6 instead. If black manages to block the central pawn, his position will be perfectly fine. Yet Kasparov suddenly thrusts his pawn to e6, placing it under triple attack. If black captures with the pawn, white strikes back with a double attack, recapturing the pawn on e7, creating an isolated pawn on e6, and continuing the assault on the exposed black king. If instead black captures with the bishop, white plants a knight on f6, and if that knight is taken, white delivers a shot on d8, the classic Van Damme spin, winning the exchange in style. But if black chooses not to take on f6 and instead moves his king back to e7, then white delivers a check, pulling the king away from defending the rook on d8. After a simple interposition, white plays knight e4, winning the exchange once again. Considering all these variations, Vladimir Kramnik wisely decides to capture on e6 with his knight. Kasparov responds with knight d4, preparing to jump to f5 and using the pin along the diagonal to attack the pawn on g7. Kramnik pushes the enemy knight away, and after knight f5, he plays rook h7, defending the pawn. For the rest of its life, that black rook would dream of nothing more than standing cramped on h7, guarding the poor pawn from the enemy's glare. Kasparov sends his bishop to f6, attacking the rook. But capturing it would mean instant checkmate from the white knight, so the rook must retreat. In this situation, the best move for white was to play f4, aiming to exploit the pin along the e-file later on. For example, after capturing on f6, white recaptures with the knight and checkmates the black king shortly after. But in the actual game, the 13th world champion hurried to restore material balance and captured the pawn on g7 with his bishop. After the pawn was taken back, white recaptured with the knight. Here, it was essential for black to take with the rook, otherwise he would fall into a deadly knight fork. Even so, white still plays knight f6, recovering the piece on d7. In response, Vladimir Borisovich attacks the knight. Kasparov plays knight e5. Black exchanges one pair of rooks, and the game transitions into a slightly worse endgame for black, but with realistic drawing chances. It's worth noting, however, that in solving the opening problems arising from the pawn sacrifice on e6, Vladimir Kramnik spent a tremendous amount of time and was already approaching severe time trouble. He played knight f4, attacking the pawn, but Kasparov was already setting a cunning trap. It turns out that the pawn on g2 cannot be captured. If the rook takes it, white plays knight d3, attacking the knight and removing the defender of the rook on g2, leading to decisive material loss. If the knight captures on g2, white uses the pin to win a piece outright. But the 14th world champion was still alert. He counterattacked the knight, forcing it to retreat to g4. Kramnik offered a rook trade, but Kasparov declined, giving a check instead. After the king stepped back, white captured a pawn, and in compensation, the black rook invaded the second rank, the so-called banquet row. Kasparov replied with rook e5, a sudden and brilliant strike that essentially decided the game. This move stunned Kramnik completely. The idea is crystal clear. White attacks the pawn on c5, threatens a double attack targeting both the knight and the f7 square. In this position, black should have taken the pawn on c2. After rook f5, black could hit back on f2 and even sacrifice a piece with rook g2. Then, after takes on f4, black would have time to capture on a2, still holding good chances to save the game. But caught in severe time trouble, Vladimir Kramnik made a fatal mistake. He immediately captured the pawn on f2. White delivered the double attack. Black counterattacked the knight, but after the retreat, both the rook and the knight on f4 were hanging. There was no choice left. A piece had to be sacrificed. A check from f1 didn't help. The king calmly stepped to h2, and soon after, white played g3, using the pin to win a piece. So Kramnik captured the pawn on g2, Kasparov took the knight, and after the strike on c2, white found a precise defensive move, rook f2. Unlike in the previous variation, black no longer had time to grab the pawn on a2, and now the position was hopeless. Of course, Kramnik wasn't ready to resign just yet. He attacked a pawn on h3, but Kasparov calmly defended it with his king. Black tried to create a passed pawn on the c-file, while white pushed his h-pawn forward. After c4 came h5. White sacrificed the last pawn on the queen side to launch a killing mechanism on the king side. Rook plus knight plus pawn on the king side, Kasparov later wrote in his commentary. If black captures the pawn, white pushes h6, and after king h8, white strikes on f7, then follows with knight f6, and there's no defense against mate. If the king runs to g5 and then tries to escape, white has a clean, forced win. After king g8 comes knight check, followed by rook e2, and the black king is doomed. If he tries king g6, then rook f6, and on king h7, the pawn simply queens. Finally, if the king hides on f8, white plays h7, and after king g7, captures on f7, and taking is impossible, since a new queen appears instantly. If king h8, white plays knight e5, and there's no escape from knight g6 checkmate. Seeing all this, Kramnik threw his rook into the defense, but even that didn't help. Kasparov gave a check, and after the king's retreat, played knight f6, threatening not only a fork, but also rook e2, with mate to follow. Another check came, but after the king stepped to h1, on move 41, Vladimir Kramnik resigned. Once again, rook e2 would have ended the game with mate. If rook g6, attacking both the knight and pawn, white would simply place the rook behind the pawn, the classic Tarrasch technique, and after rook f6, promote a new queen. And with that, Garry Kasparov finally broke through Kramnik's Berlin Wall, proving to the entire chess world that he was number one not only in rating, but in every aspect of the game. What do you think of this masterpiece? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to support the video with a like and a share. See you in the next one.